A dying cowboy asked his best friend for one final favor, but the woman waiting at the end of that promise had a secret no letter ever mentioned. The horse came back without its rider. Snow whipped across the canyon, stinging Ruby's face as she pulled harder on the reins. Somewhere beyond the white wall of wind, a man was trapped in the mountains. Her fingers were numb. The saddle creaked beneath her. Then, through the storm, she spotted something dark against the snow. A coat, a boot, a motionless shape beneath a rock ledge. And in that instant, one question mattered more than any promise ever made. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from today. The river had looked calm at sunrise. By noon, it was roaring like something alive. Snowmelt from the mountains had swollen every creek feeding Red Canyon Valley, and now the bitter Elk River churned brown and angry beneath a sky the color of old iron. Garrett Cole sat tall in the saddle, guiding nervous cattle toward the crossing. Water slapped against their legs. The animals snorted and pushed together. "Easy," he muttered. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and pine. Ahead of him rode Wade Mercer. For nearly 20 years, Garrett had known the broad-shouldered cowboy. They had broken horses together, slept under the same storms, and buried more friends than either cared to count. Wade turned in his saddle. "Once we get these fools across, coffee's on me." Garrett shook his head. "You said that last week. And I meant it last week, too." The river answered with a sudden crack. A shout rose downstream. A wagon wheel had slipped from the bank. The wagon tilted. A young boy tumbled into the water. Everything happened at once. His mother screamed. The current grabbed the child and spun him away. Before anyone else could move, Wade kicked his horse forward. "Wade!" Garrett's voice disappeared beneath the roar. The cowboy launched himself into the river. For one terrible second, both figures vanished beneath the muddy surface. Then Wade appeared again, one arm wrapped around the struggling boy. Men rushed downstream. Ropes flew, hands grabbed. The child was pulled onto shore, coughing and crying. Wade reached the bank too. But something was wrong. Very wrong. A floating log had struck him during the rescue. Garrett saw it in the way his friend struggled to breathe. Saw it in the blood soaking through his shirt. The storm arrived before sunset. Rain hammered the canvas shelter where they laid Wade on a narrow cot. The air smelled of wet wool, mud, and kerosene. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. Inside, time seemed to slow. Garrett sat beside the bed. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Rain drummed overhead. Finally, Wade reached beneath his blanket. His hand emerged holding a small wooden box. The corners were worn smooth. The brass latch had been polished by years of use. "Need you to do something for me." Garrett looked at the box, then at his friend. "No." A faint smile crossed Wade's face. "You don't even know what it is." "Because I know that look." The smile lingered, then faded. Wade's breathing grew shallower. "There's a woman." Garrett stared at him. "A woman?" "Name's Ruby Bennett." The rain intensified. "She lives in Dodge City." Garrett waited. Wade swallowed hard. She's the closest thing I ever had to family." "You never mentioned her." "I know." For years, Wade had spoken little about his private life. Most cowboys didn't. The frontier taught men to carry loneliness quietly. Wade nodded toward the box. "Letters." Garrett opened it. Dozens of envelopes sat inside, tied neatly with faded ribbon. Years of correspondence. Years of conversations. Years of hope. "She agreed to marry me," Wade whispered. Garrett blinked. "You got engaged?" A tiny nod. "Through letters." Thunder shook the shelter. "I was going to meet her this fall." His eyes closed briefly. but I ain't making it to fall." Garrett looked away. The rain hid many sounds. It could not hide the truth. Wade's voice weakened. "She's alone, Garrett." Silence stretched. "She thinks somebody's finally coming for her." Another breath. Another struggle. "Don't let her think I abandoned her." Garrett's jaw tightened. Outside, lightning flashed. Inside, the wooden box sat heavy in his lap. "I don't know her." "I know." "You're asking a lot." "I know that too." Wade managed the ghost of a smile. "You always did complain before doing the right thing." For the first time that day, Garrett laughed. Only once. Only briefly. Then the laughter disappeared. They both knew. The storm would pass. Wade would not. Hours later, long after midnight, Garrett still sat beside the cot. Wade drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes talking about cattle drives, sometimes mentioning places they'd ridden through years ago. Once he whispered Ruby's name. Just once. Near dawn, the rain finally eased. The silence felt enormous. Wade opened his eyes one final time. "Promise me." Garrett stared at the floor, then at the wooden box, then at the man who had once dragged him from beneath a collapsing horse when he was 19, the man who had shared his last biscuit more times than he could remember, the man who had become his brother without sharing a drop of blood. "I promise." Wade nodded. The tension left his face. A few moments later, he was gone. The morning sun rose pale behind the clouds. They buried him beside a cottonwood overlooking the river. No preacher. No crowd. Only a handful of cowboys standing in damp boots. The earth was still soft from rain. Garrett said nothing. When the grave was finished, he placed Wade's hat on the mound for a moment, then picked it back up. The wind moved through the grass. The river flowed on as though nothing had happened. 3 days later, Garrett packed his saddlebags. The wooden box rode beside him. The journey to Kansas would take weeks, long enough to reconsider, long enough to turn back, long enough to convince himself somebody else could do it. But every morning he woke and kept riding. One night beneath a stand of pines, he finally opened the box again. Most of the letters were ordinary. Weather, work, daily struggles, life. Then he found a photograph. He held it near the campfire. A woman sat straight-backed before the camera. Simple dress, calm expression, strong eyes. Eyes that looked directly at the photographer, not pleading, not apologizing, not trying to impress anyone, just looking. Garrett found himself staring longer than he intended. The fire popped softly beside him. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called. He turned the photograph over. Ruby Bennett. Nothing else. No message. No decoration. Just a name. Garrett slid the photograph back into the box. Yet long after the campfire burned low, he found himself thinking about those eyes. The eyes of someone who seemed entirely too familiar with disappointment. And for the first time since Wade died, he wondered what would happen when he finally reached Dodge City. Because one thing was already clear. No letter, no promise, no story from Wade could possibly prepare him for the woman waiting at the end of that road. Dodge City appeared beneath a haze of summer dust 3 weeks later. Garrett rode down Front Street slowly, passing wagons, hitching rails, and storefronts with faded signs swinging in the breeze. The smell of horse sweat mixed with fresh bread drifting from somewhere nearby. He stopped outside a bakery called Bennett & Sons Bakery. The name was misleading. There were no sons, and judging by the woman carrying flour sacks through the rear door, there was barely a Bennett left. Garrett tied his horse and watched for a moment. Ruby Bennett moved with the efficiency of someone who had no time to waste. Her sleeves were rolled above her wrists. A white apron covered a faded blue dress. A strand of dark hair had escaped her bonnet and stuck to her cheek from the heat. She carried a 50-pound sack of flour across the yard without asking for help. The shop owner stood near the doorway counting coins. He barely looked up. "Careful with that," he called. "Wouldn't want to lose any product." Ruby said nothing. She simply kept walking. Something about that bothered Garrett more than he expected. Inside, the bakery was crowded. Fresh biscuits cooled on wire racks. Coffee simmered in a metal pot near the stove. A customer complained loudly about an order. Another demanded change from $1. Ruby handled everything calmly, never raising her voice, never rushing, never apologizing for taking up space. Near closing time, Garrett finally stepped forward. "Miss Bennett?" She looked up. For a second, neither spoke. The eyes from the photograph were exactly the same. Steady, observant. The kind of eyes that measured a man before trusting him. "Yes? My name is Garrett Cole." Nothing changed in her expression. "I knew Wade Mercer." The silence that followed seemed to absorb every sound in the room. Ruby slowly set down the tray she was carrying. The customer service the counter quietly backed away. Something in her face told Garrett she already knew. Not the details. Just the truth. People waiting for good news usually smiled first. She did not. "When?" she asked. "About a month ago." The room felt smaller. "Was it quick?" Garrett nodded. "As quick as such things can be." Ruby lowered her eyes. Not crying, not breaking, just standing very still. A moment later, she untied her apron. "Mrs. Talbot?" she called toward the kitchen. "I need a few minutes." No one argued. She led Garrett into a narrow room behind the bakery. A single window overlooked an alley. A wooden chair sat beside a small table. Nothing fancy. Nothing personal. The sort of room used by someone who spent all day working and all night resting for the next one. Garrett placed the wooden box on the table. Ruby stared at it, then reached out carefully, almost reverently. Her fingers paused on the brass latch. "You carried this all the way from Montana?" "Yes." She opened it. The letters were exactly where Wade had left them. On top rested the sealed envelope addressed in Wade's handwriting. Ruby sat down. The chair creaked softly. For several minutes, she read in silence. Garrett looked toward the window, giving her privacy. Outside, a wagon rattled over loose stones. Somewhere a dog barked. Eventually, she folded the letter, placed it back in the box, and sat quietly. He always wrote exactly the way he spoke. Garrett nodded. "That sounds right." A faint smile appeared, then vanished. "What happens now?" Garrett took a slow breath. This was the part he had rehearsed for hundreds of miles, and still it sounded awkward. "He asked me to come." Ruby looked at him. "He asked me to keep a promise." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of promise?" Garrett met her gaze. "He wanted me to marry you." The silence afterward felt almost physical. Ruby stared at him, then laughed once, not because anything was funny, because the alternative was something else entirely. "A replacement?" "No. That's what it sounds like. It wasn't meant that way. But it is that way." She stood, walked toward the window, folded her arms. The afternoon sunlight outlined her profile. "I spent 2 years writing letters to a man I never met." Her voice remained calm. "Now you're telling me he died and sent someone else instead." Garrett didn't answer. There was no good answer. Ruby turned. The hurt was there now. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. "I'd rather sleep in a barn than marry a man who feels sorry for me." The words landed exactly as Wade had warned they might. Garrett nodded once. Fair enough. That seemed to surprise her. No argument? You earned the right to decide your own future. Ruby blinked. Garrett continued. I have a ranch house. Not interested. You'd have your own room. Silence. You'd have paid work. Another silence. You could leave whenever you wanted. Her expression changed slightly. Only slightly. I wouldn't owe you anything? No. You wouldn't expect gratitude? No. Or affection? No. Garrett leaned back in his chair. I made a promise, that's all. Ruby studied him, looking for something. A trap. A lie. An expectation hidden beneath the words. She didn't seem to find one. I need time. You should take it. 3 days later, she met him at the train depot. A single trunk sat beside her, along with a small leather case and the wooden box. The train whistle echoed across the platform. Garrett helped load her luggage. Neither spoke much. The Kansas wind carried dust across the tracks. As the train finally began moving west, Ruby sat beside the window. The countryside rolled past slowly. Hours later, while Garrett slept across the aisle, she opened the wooden box again, carefully, methodically, the way someone handled precious things. That was when she noticed it. One envelope hidden beneath the others, different from the rest, unopened, never mailed, addressed to her, written in Wade's hand. Ruby stared at it for a long time, then slid it back into the box. She did not open it. Not yet. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly beneath the fading sunset, and somewhere beyond that horizon waited Montana. A stranger, a marriage neither of them wanted, and a letter carrying a secret that had survived the journey of a dead man. The train finally reached Montana beneath a sky streaked with pale autumn clouds. The air felt different here, colder, cleaner. The mountains stood in the distance like ancient walls guarding the valley. Ruby stepped down from the train car and adjusted her gloves. Garrett was already unloading her trunk. Neither mentioned the unopened letter. Neither mentioned the future. The wagon ride to Red Canyon Valley lasted most of the afternoon. Dust rose behind the wheels. Golden grass rippled across the plains. A herd of cattle moved slowly along a distant ridge. Ruby watched everything in silence. Garrett respected the silence. By sunset, the valley appeared. A scattering of ranch buildings sat beneath towering red cliffs. Smoke drifted from chimneys. The main ranch house stood on a slight rise overlooking the pasture. This is home, Garrett said. Ruby studied it. Not large, not fancy, just sturdy. The kind of place built by hard years and practical hands. 3 days later, they stood inside a small church near town. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. A preacher with silver hair read from a worn Bible. 2 ranch hands served as witnesses. No flowers decorated the room. No music played. No wedding guests filled the pews. When the vows ended, neither moved. The preacher cleared his throat, then smiled softly. Well, he said, I suppose that's that. Ruby signed the marriage ledger. Garrett signed beneath her name. The paper crackled beneath the pen. A marriage had been created, but neither knew what to call it. Outside, the wind rattled the church door. They climbed into the wagon and headed home. No celebration followed. No wedding supper. Only the long road back to the ranch. Garrett carried her trunk inside. The larger bedroom is yours. Ruby glanced toward the hallway. And yours? The smaller one. You don't have to do that. I know. That was the end of the discussion. The first week settled into a careful rhythm. Garrett left before sunrise. Coffee brewed on the stove every morning. His boots crossed the porch before dawn. By the time he returned each evening, dust covered his jeans and jacket. Ruby spent her days learning the ranch. She baked bread, mended shirts, organized the pantry. Eventually, she found herself helping with paperwork stacked in a corner cabinet. Old receipts, feed invoices, supply records. Numbers had always made sense to her. People were harder. One evening, Garrett came home to find several ledgers spread across the dining table. Ruby looked up. "Do you know you're paying 2 different suppliers for the same feed shipment?" Garrett stopped removing his gloves. "What?" She turned one ledger toward him. "These invoices are duplicates." He stared, then looked again, then a third time. "I never noticed." "I can tell." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, but close. From that night forward, the paperwork slowly became theirs. Not just his, not just hers. Theirs. Weeks passed. The ranch felt less unfamiliar. The kitchen no longer echoed. The silence at dinner became easier. Sometimes Garrett would ask how her day went. Sometimes Ruby would ask about the cattle. Small conversations, nothing important. Yet somehow everything important. Meanwhile, town gossip traveled faster than any horse. Agnes Holloway owned the largest general store in Red Canyon Valley. She knew everyone's business, and when she didn't know it, she invented it. According to Agnes, Ruby had arrived with secrets. According to Agnes, Garrett had made a terrible mistake. According to Agnes, no good ever came from strangers. Ruby heard the whispers. She ignored them, mostly. One afternoon, she entered the general store to buy coffee beans and lamp oil. The room felt quieter than usual. Not silent, just quieter. Enough to notice. Agnes stood behind the counter arranging canned peaches. Her smile never reached her eyes. "Afternoon, Mrs. Cole." Ruby nodded. "Afternoon." The transaction remained polite, but the tension lingered like smoke. As Ruby stepped outside carrying her parcel, she saw 2 women speaking softly near a wagon. Their conversation stopped when they noticed her looking. She kept walking, head high, back straight, the same way she always had. The incident might have ended there, except it didn't. A week later, Garrett entered the saloon after a long day repairing fences. Several cowboys sat around a card table. One of them laughed. "How's married life treating you, Garrett?" "Fine." The man took another drink. "Heard your wife has quite a history." The room shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. Garrett placed his hat on the counter. "What history?" The cowboy shrugged. "Just what folks are saying." Garrett looked at him. The stare lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough. The man suddenly became interested in his whiskey. Garrett walked away. He said nothing, but he remembered. And over the next few weeks he heard more. Little comments, half-finished rumors, questions nobody asked directly. Ruby noticed changes too. The way conversations paused when she entered a room. The way certain people smiled without warmth. The way Agnes Holloway always seemed to know exactly where she had been. One cold afternoon near the end of October, Ruby sat alone on the porch, peeling apples for pies. Garrett returned early from work. He stopped beside the railing. Neither spoke immediately. The valley stretched before them in golden evening light. Finally, Garrett nodded toward the apples. "You make enough pie, you'll feed the whole territory." Ruby almost smiled. Somebody around here needs feeding. For a brief moment, they looked at each other. Not husband and wife, not strangers. Something in between. Something neither knew how to name yet. Then Garrett looked away first. The wind shifted across the valley, carrying distant cattle sounds from the pasture below. And somewhere beyond those hills, winter was already coming. By the first week of November, frost covered the ranch every morning. Thin sheets of ice formed along the water troughs. The grass turned brittle beneath boots. The cattle grew restless. Old-timers in Red Canyon Valley watched the sky more often than usual. The signs were there. A hard winter was coming. Garrett spent long evenings studying maps spread across the kitchen table. Ruby often sat across from him with account books open beside a lantern. The yellow light softened the room. Outside, the wind scratched against the windows. Inside, neither seemed eager to end the quiet. One night, Garrett pointed toward a route drawn in pencil. "We may have to move the herd south earlier this year." Ruby looked up. "You think it'll be that bad?" He folded the map carefully. "My father used to say the mountains always warn you first." "And what are they saying now?" Garrett glanced toward the dark window. "They're saying hurry." 3 days later, he left before sunrise with 6 cowboys and nearly 500 head of cattle. Ruby stood on the porch wrapped in a brown wool coat. Garrett adjusted his saddle. For a moment, it looked as though he wanted to say something. Instead, he simply nodded. "I'll be back before the week's over." Ruby returned the nod. "Safe trip." Then they rode away. The ranch felt unusually empty after that. The ticking clock in the kitchen sounded louder. The wind seemed sharper. Every evening, Ruby lit the lantern near the front window, a habit she never explained, a habit nobody asked about. On the second day, snow began falling. At first it came softly, tiny flakes drifting through the valley. By nightfall, the storm strengthened. The mountains disappeared behind white curtains. Fence posts vanished beneath drifts. The world narrowed. By the third morning, the blizzard had become something far worse. The wind howled across the valley like a living thing. Snow struck the windows hard enough to rattle the glass. Around noon, a rider appeared through the storm. One of Garrett's men. Alone. His horse stumbled into the yard, nearly exhausted. Ruby hurried outside. The cowboy removed his hat. Snow clung to his coat and beard. His expression told the story before he spoke. "The herd scattered." Ruby's stomach tightened. "And Garrett?" The man hesitated, then looked down. His horse came back. The valley seemed to fall silent, even with the storm raging. Ruby heard nothing, only those 4 words. His horse came back. That night nobody slept. The preacher prayed. The ranch hands searched maps. Neighbors gathered in worried groups. The storm continued. One day passed, then another. No sign of Garrett. By the third morning, people stopped speaking about rescue. They started speaking about loss. Ruby listened, then quietly walked upstairs. She dressed in heavy wool layers, pulled on riding gloves, buttoned her coat. When she came downstairs, one of the ranch hands blocked the door. "You can't go out there." Ruby picked up her scarf. "Move! Mrs. Cole, move!" Something in her voice made him step aside. Minutes later, she rode into the storm. The mountains were almost invisible. Snow reached the horse's knees. Wind cut through every layer of clothing. Hour after hour, she searched canyons and ridges. The daylight slowly faded. Then she saw something. A patch of dark leather against white snow. A horse blanket, half buried. Nearby, beneath a rocky ledge, she found Garrett. Alive. Barely. His leg was trapped between fallen stones. One glove was missing. His face was pale from cold. When he opened his eyes, confusion crossed them, then recognition. "Ruby?" She dropped beside him. The relief nearly stole her breath. "You stubborn man." A faint smile appeared, then vanished. Together, With help from 2 searchers she later flagged down, they brought him home. The doctor arrived before midnight. Frostbite threatened 2 fingers. His shoulder was badly bruised. But he would live. For 3 days, Garrett drifted in and out of sleep. Ruby remained nearby, changing cold cloths, checking lamps, measuring medicine, sometimes reading quietly by the fire. The unopened letter remained inside Wade's wooden box, waiting. On the 4th evening, snow tapped gently against the window. The storm had finally passed. Ruby sat alone beside the fireplace. The letter rested in her hands. Its seal had yellowed with age. For a long time she stared at it. Then she opened it. The paper crackled softly. Wade's familiar handwriting filled the page. As she read, her expression changed. Line by line, paragraph by paragraph. Years earlier, Wade had investigated the accusation that ruined her reputation. He had spoken to former workers, collected statements, tracked records. The man accused of theft had manipulated company books himself. Ruby had never stolen anything. She had been blamed for someone else's crime. Every name, every witness, every piece of evidence. Wade had gathered it all and left it behind. Tears blurred the page, not from sadness, not entirely, from finally seeing proof that someone had believed her all along. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Garrett was awake. Later that night, she entered his room carrying a fresh cup of coffee. The lamp beside the bed cast warm light across the walls. Garrett looked weaker than usual, but alive, very much alive. Ruby set the cup down carefully. Neither spoke at first. The silence felt different now, softer. Garrett studied her face, then quietly asked, "Would it have mattered if I never came back?" The question hung between them. Simple, honest, terrifying. Ruby lowered her eyes. She tried to answer. Nothing came. The room blurred. A tear slipped free. Then another. The first tears she had shed since Wade's death. Since Kansas, since before that, Garrett watched silently. No smile. No victory. Only understanding. And for the first time since this strange marriage had begun, neither of them looked away. The room stayed quiet. The lamp flickered softly beside the bed. Snow brushed against the window like fingertips. Garrett finally reached for her hand. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Ruby let him. For a long moment, neither spoke. There was nothing left to explain. The answer had already been given. Not with words. With 3 sleepless days. With a ride into a blizzard. With tears she had spent years refusing to shed. Garrett squeezed her hand once, then released it. The next morning, sunlight reflected across fresh snow and filled the valley with blinding silver light. Life moved forward, as it always did. But something had shifted. At breakfast, Garrett lingered at the table longer than usual. Ruby poured coffee into his tin cup. He thanked her. Their eyes met. Neither looked away first. Small things. But they mattered. A week later, Sheriff Amos Turner arrived carrying a leather satchel. Inside were copies of statements and records Wade had collected over several years. Old payroll sheets, signed witness accounts, letters from former employees. Enough evidence to reopen questions that had followed Ruby for nearly a decade. The sheriff spent days writing inquiries and sending telegram requests east. By Christmas, the answers began returning, one by one, each confirming the same truth. Ruby Bennett had never stolen anything. The accusations had been built on lies. On a cold January afternoon, the sheriff stood in front of the general store. Half the town gathered nearby. Snow rested on wagon roofs and fence rails. Ruby had not wanted to attend. Garrett convinced her anyway. You deserve to hear it. The sheriff unfolded a document. His voice carried across the street. He explained the findings, the records, the witnesses, the false reports. When he finished, nobody spoke for several seconds. The silence felt heavier than any speech. Across the crowd stood Agnes Holloway, the woman who had spent months feeding rumors through town. Her face tightened as neighbors slowly turned away from her. Not angry, just disappointed. The gossip she had helped spread no longer had a place to stand. Ruby listened quietly, then looked down at her gloves. For years, she had imagined this moment, thought it would change everything. Instead, she felt strangely calm. The past no longer owned her. That was enough. As the crowd dispersed, Garrett stepped beside her. You all right? Ruby nodded. I thought I'd feel different. And? She glanced toward the mountains. I think I already got what mattered. Garrett understood. A week later, he asked her to ride with him. They left the ranch after lunch. The sky was clear, the air sharp. Their horses climbed a narrow trail above Red Canyon Valley. Below them stretched endless grasslands dusted with snow. Smoke curled from distant chimneys. The river wound through the valley like silver ribbon. Eventually, Garrett stopped near the top of a ridge. The same ridge Wade had once shown him years earlier. Neither dismounted immediately. The wind moved gently through the dry grass. Ruby looked across the valley. It's beautiful up here. It is. Garrett climbed down first, then helped her from the saddle. For several moments, they simply stood side by side, looking out, listening. The world felt very large and very quiet. Finally, Garrett spoke. I kept Wade's promise. Ruby turned toward him. His voice was steady, soft, honest. Somewhere along the way, he paused. The faintest smile appeared. You became mine. Ruby stared at him, then laughed through sudden tears. Not because the words were perfect, because they were Garrett's. Simple. Unpolished. Completely true. She stepped closer. Good. His brow lifted. Good? Because somewhere along the way. Her smile grew. You became mine too. Garrett laughed. The sound disappeared into the open valley. Then he pulled her into his arms. No audience, no preacher, no witnesses. Just two people who had spent months pretending they were building a life out of duty, when it had really become something else. Something neither expected. Spring arrived slowly. Snow melted from the hillsides. Wildflowers returned. Ruby's baking became known throughout the valley. Travelers stopped at the ranch asking for pies they had heard about from neighbors. Before long, she converted an unused storage building into a small bakery. The smell of fresh bread drifted across the property every morning. Widows and struggling women found work there. Ruby hired them quietly, never making speeches, simply opening the door. The ranch prospered as well. Garrett no longer returned to an empty table, no longer spent evenings staring into a fire alone. The house felt lived in, warm, real. One evening, nearly a year after the blizzard, the sun sank behind red mountains. Golden light spilled across the valley. Ruby and Garrett sat together on the porch. Between them rested 2 cups of coffee. Near the front door stood Wade's wooden box, still preserved, still respected, but no longer carrying the weight of obligation. Only gratitude. The wind moved through the grass. A horse shifted somewhere near the barn. Far off, cattle bells echoed softly. Garrett leaned back in his chair. Ruby rested her hand over his. Neither felt the need to fill the silence. For the first time in many years, Neither of them was fighting the world alone. And in a place where both had once expected only survival, they had somehow found a home. Not because of a promise, not because of pity, not because of circumstance, but because two wounded hearts had slowly learned to trust the person sitting beside them. The mountains darkened, the stars appeared one by one, and as night settled over Red Canyon Valley, the life neither of them had expected became the life they would never trade for anything. Sometimes I wonder what I would have done in Ruby's place. What if the world had spent years telling me who I was? What if every door seemed half closed before I ever reached it? Would I still have found the courage to trust someone again? And what about Garrett? Would I have kept a promise that wasn't really mine? Would I have opened my heart after spending so many years convinced that survival was enough? Maybe that's why this story stays with me. Because beneath the ranch, the storms, and the mountains, it reminds us of something simple. The people who change our lives rarely arrive the way we expect. Sometimes they come disguised as responsibility. Sometimes they arrive carrying old wounds of their own. And sometimes healing begins so quietly that we almost miss it. A shared table, a long silence, a hand that stays when it could walk away. Wade's promise brought two lonely people to the same doorstep. But it was trust, patience, and everyday kindness that built the life that followed. If you've ever been given a second chance, or if someone's quiet loyalty helped you through a difficult season, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what part of this story stayed with you most. And if stories like this make the world feel a little warmer at the end of the day, I hope you'll join me again. There are still many more tales waiting beyond the next trail. Stories of courage, mystery, healing, and unexpected love. Until then, take care of yourself and keep a little room in your heart for the good things you never saw coming.